from the courtroom when it's necessary for me to hear legal arguments from the lawyers. And if you come in contact with the parties, lawyers or witnesses, do not speak with them, or their part, the parties, lawyers, and witnesses will not contact or speak with the jurors. Do not listen to any conversation about this case. Do not research any information you may personally think that might be helpful to you in understanding the issues presented. Do not investigate the case on your own or visit the scene. Do not read any newspaper reports or listen to any news reports on radio or television about the trial. Do not consult dictionaries, computers, websites, or other reference materials for additional information. Do not seek information regarding the public records or of any party or any witnesses in this case. Any information you obtain outside the courtroom could be misleading, inaccurate, or incomplete. Relying on this information is unfair because the parties will not have an opportunity to refute, explain, or correct it. Do not communicate with anyone about this trial or your experience as a juror while you're serving on the jury. Do not use a computer, cell phone, or other electronic devices with communication capabilities to share any information about this case. For example, do not communicate by blog, email, text message, Twitter, X, or any other way on or off the computer. Do not permit anyone to communicate with you, and if anyone does so despite your telling them not to, you should report that to me. This case must be decided by you, the jurors, based on the evidence presented in the courtroom. People not serving on the jury have not heard the evidence, and it is improper for them to influence your deliberations and the decision in this case. After the trial is complete, you're free to communicate with anyone in any manner. These rules are intended to assure that jurors remain impartial throughout the trial. If any juror has reason to believe that another juror has violated these rules, you should report that to me. If jurors do not comply with these rules, it could result in a new trial involving additional time and significant expense to the parties and the taxpayers. You are to decide the case solely on the evidence offered and received at trial. Evidence is, first, the sworn testimony of witnesses, both in direct and cross-examination, regardless of who called the witnesses. Second, the exhibits the court has received, whether or not the exhibits go to the jury room. Third, any facts to which the lawyers have agreed or stipulated, or which the court has directed you to find. Attorneys for each side have a right and the duty to object to what they consider are improper questions asked of witnesses and to the omission of other evidence which they believe is not properly admissible. You should not draw any conclusions from the fact an objection was made. By allowing testimony or other evidence to be received over the objection of counsel, the court is not indicating any opinion about the evidence. You jurors are the judges of the credibility of the witnesses and the weight of the evidence. You're not required to, but you may take notes during this trial, except during opening statements and closing arguments. The court will provide you with materials. In taking notes, you must be careful that it does not distract you from carefully listening to and observing the witnesses. You may rely on your notes to refresh your memory during your deliberations. Otherwise, keep them confidential. After the trial, the notes will be collected and destroyed. You will not have a copy of the written transcript of the trial testimony available during your deliberations. You should pay careful attention to all the testimony because you must rely primarily on your memory of the evidence and the testimony introduced during the trial. During the course of the trial, attorneys may refer to or use police reports with witnesses. Normally, these police reports will not be provided to you. You are not to, if you're not provided with a police report, you should use your collective memory regarding any reference to police reports. Credibility of the witnesses. It is your duty of the jury to scrutinize and to weigh the testimony of witnesses to determine the effect of the evidence as a whole. You are the sole judges of the credibility, that is, the believability of the witness and the witnesses, and of the weight to be given to their testimony. In determining the credibility of each witness and the weight you give the testimony of each witness, consider these factors. Whether the witness has an interest or lack of interest in the result of this trial. The witness's conduct, appearance, and demeanor on the witness stand. The clearness or lack of clearness of the witness's recollection. the opportunity the witness had for observing and for knowing the matters the witness testified about, the reasonableness of the witness's testimony, the apparent intelligence of the witness, bias or prejudice, if any, has been shown, possible motives for falsifying testimony, and any and all other facts and circumstances during the trial which tend either to support or to discredit testimony. Then give to the testimony of each witness the weight you believe it should receive. There's no magic way for you to evaluate the testimony. Instead, you should use your common sense and experience. In everyday life, you determine for yourself the reliability of things people say to you. You should do the same thing here. The information in this case, in count 1, charges second-degree reckless homicide. Second-degree reckless homicide, as defined by 940.06 of the Criminal Code of Wisconsin, is committed by one who recklessly causes the death of another human being. Elements of the crime that the state must prove. 1, the defendant caused the death of Mark A. Phillips. Cause means the defendant's act was a substantial factor in producing the death. 2, the defendant caused the death by criminally reckless conduct. Criminally reckless conduct means the conduct created a risk of death or great bodily harm to another person, and the risk of death or great bodily harm was unreasonable and substantial, and the defendant was aware that her conduct created the unreasonable and substantial risk of death or great bodily harm. Jury's decision. You're satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant caused the death of Mark A. Phillips by criminally reckless conduct. You should find the defendant guilty of second-degree reckless homicide. If you're not so satisfied, you must find the defendant not guilty. Burden of proof and presumption of innocence. In reaching your verdict, examine the evidence with care and caution, act with judgment, reason, and prudence. Presumption of innocence. Defendants are not required to prove their innocence. The law presumes every person charged with the commission of an offense to be innocent. That presumption requires the finding of not guilty unless in your deliberations you find it's overcome by evidence which satisfies you beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant is guilty. State's burden of proof. The burden of establishing every fact necessary to constitute guilt is upon the state. Before you can return a verdict of guilty, the evidence must satisfy you beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant is guilty. Reasonable hypothesis. If you can reconcile the evidence upon any reasonable hypothesis consistent with the defendant's innocence, you should do so and return a verdict of not guilty. Meaning of reasonable doubt. The term reasonable doubt means a doubt based upon reason and common sense. It is a doubt for which a reason can be given arising from a fair and rational consideration of the evidence or lack of evidence. It means such a doubt it was cause a person of ordinary prudence to pause, or to hesitate when called upon to act in the most important affairs of life. A reasonable doubt is not a doubt which is based on mere guesswork or speculation. A doubt which arises merely from sympathy or from fear to return a verdict of guilt is not a reasonable doubt. A reasonable doubt is not a doubt such as may be used to escape the responsibility of a decision. While it is your duty to give the defendant the benefit of every reasonable doubt, you are not to search for doubt. You are to search for the truth and give the defendant the benefit of any reasonable doubt that remains after carefully considering all the evidence. Opening statements. Lawyers will now make opening statements. The purpose of an opening statement is to give the lawyers an opportunity to tell you what they expect the evidence will show, so you will better understand the evidence as it's introduced during the trial. I must caution you, however, the opening statements are not evidence. With that, we'll begin with the opening statement. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. As the judge had indicated, the opening statement is an opportunity for me to kind of tell you what you're going to see in some of the evidence, and there's different ways to do that. For this case, you're going to hear a lot of different pieces of evidence, and a lot of them will happen at the same time. A lot of them will happen in order, depending on which witness tells which piece of evidence. It might be hard to keep it all straight. So for my opening statement, I decided to tell this case because at the end of the day, kind of like what Judge had said, you're going to hear a lot of different types of evidence. Ultimately, you're going to hear a story. Here, Mark and Lori Phillips were married in December 2018. They lived together in the town of Onalaska. The newlyweds decided they were going to move to Bismarck, and on the night of February 22nd, 2019, they had left their home in Onalaska to meet up friends for a last hurrah of sorts before their departure. They arrived at Sloopy's alma mater, where they had dinner and drinks around 4 to 5 p.m. And at Sloopy's, by all accounts, had a good time. With them were Lori's friends, who you'll hear from, Hannah Klinsky and Adam Stevens. After Sloopy's, the group moved to the Dive Bar, which is my understanding used to be located on Ward Avenue. It is no longer there. But they went to the Dive Bar a little after 6 p.m., where they met up with several members of Hannah's family. Lori and Mark, at some point, had wanted to go to Features at Holmen for a drawing. They had left the Dive Bar at around 8:12 p.m. Prior to leaving the Dive Bar, Lori had run into an acquaintance of hers, a man named Terry LaFleur, and apparently this had made Mark upset. What happens next is uncertain, but Lori would later state to investigator Fritz Leinfelder that Mark had become very angry about the encounter with Mr. LaFleur. Lori stated in the Dive Bar parking lot that Mark had pushed her up against the truck, became physical with her when they were in the truck, pushed her down between the seats, and at one point had put her in a chokehold, causing her diamond earring to fall out. At that point, Lori demanded that Mark take her back to the Dive Bar so that she could be with her friends and get a ride home from them. Lori returns to the Dive Bar at 8:31 p.m. or thereabouts, and Mark also returns to the Dive Bar at about 8:45 p.m. At 8:52, Mark sends Lori a text stating that he is sorry and that he loves her. Hannah and her friends and family leave the Dive Bar sometime after Mark and Lori are both there, as that group had planned to go on to Winona to the VFW there for some drinks. Lori and Mark leave the Dive Bar for the last time at about 10:09 p.m., and that is the last time that anyone other than Lori Phillips saw Mr. Phillips alive. You'll hear from Pete Sloan, one of the cops, investigators and officers who had done work on this case. He'll tell you it takes about 30 minutes to get from the Dive Bar to Mark and Lori's house in Onalaska, which would place them, based on the time we know they leave, somewhere in the 10:40 range. Lori later stated throughout her interviews that she and Mark had begun arguing again on their way home. When they got home, they pulled in to what will be referred to as the M driveway. You'll see a picture of the house in our first witness and how it's set up, but what will be referred to as the M driveway by us, with the truck parked in their driveway next to the back door of the house, facing what will be referred to as the W driveway. It makes kind of a horseshoe looking setup, and you'll get a chance to see a picture of that. At this time, Lori later stated that Mark had went inside the house. She did not say for how long. She did not remember if she had also went inside, but at some point, she tells Mark that she's leaving with the truck. Lori explained that Mark told her that he wanted to get some things from the truck and went around to the passenger seat. We don't know exactly what happens next. Lori explained that while going through his items in the passenger seat or thereabouts, Mark picks up a novelty can cozy that you'll see a picture of, and he throws it at her. At which point she flips it back at him because the passenger door was open, and you'll see pictures of where that cozy is. But he throws this cozy at her, says something, she flips it back. She tells investigator Leinfelder when she meets with him later, so then I was just like, F this, and I was out. I'm gone. At some point, Lori explained that Mark had went around to the front of the truck, towards the driver's side door, and either attempted to punch the window or with his windshield with his hand, or she thought he was going to, or she thought he was coming after her. At any rate, Lori was leaving, and she drives out the W driveway, pulling into a subdivision down the road, and we'll hear testimony about kind of where we think that is. At 10:51 p.m., so now about in the 11 minutes after we believe they had arrived home, Lori texts her friend Hannah, the same Hannah from the bar, and tells her that Mark just freaked again, and that he was at the passenger side of the truck and tried to come around the truck, but I took off. She sends 2 more texts to Hannah at 10:53 and 10:55, with the last one stating, "He tried to punch the window in on the truck, then he got inside and grabbed my face and pushed me down in between the seats. My left earring is gone, if that tells you anything." At 10:57, Lori sends Mark a text to the effect that she wishes him the best, but that the best will never be with her, that he lost everything that night, and that she can't believe he put hands on her. She tells him to have good luck in Bismarck, and Mark does not respond. At 10:58, Hannah texts Lori again and explains that her dad could come pick her up if needed. Lori texts Hannah at 10:59 that she is 2 miles down the road in that subdivision, and that she was good. Lori would later tell investigator Leinfelder that she pulled into the subdivision down the road to see if Mark was chasing her. Mark and Lori had 3 security cameras on their home, which, when activated, detect and capture motion. The cameras can also be viewed via a live stream. Lori arms the cameras, meaning she turns them on so that they can detect motion, at 11:04 p.m., and then checks the live stream of one of the cameras at 11:08 and 10 seconds. At 11:10, Lori begins searching for hotel rooms, and she eventually travels to the Comfort Inn in Baymont, only to find out that she had booked the room for the wrong night. During this time, Lori checks the live stream of the 3 cameras at 11:20, 02, 11:20, 30, and 11:21, 03, respectively. We know from security footage later gathered that Lori arrives at the Baymont at about 11:44 p.m., and then she eventually goes to the Woodman's parking lot at 11:57 when she is unable to get a room at the Baymont. At 12:08, Lori searches quotes relating to physical abuse, and at 12:10, she texts Mark's phone one of the quotes that she finds about how an abuser can make one feel. There is no response. Lori checks the 3 cameras again via live stream at 12:39, 12:14:10, and 12:14:30. Lori remains at Woodman's and checks the 3 cameras again via live stream at 1:35:38, 1:35:51, 1:36:15, and at about 1:38 in the morning, she searches for hotels once more in the area, and then she leaves to the Woodman's parking lot at, we think, 1:43 based on the footage, turning from North Kinney Cooley Road to WI-16 EB on her way back to the house. At 1:51:49, Lori disarms the camera system. She turns off the motion sensor. She would say to investigator Leinfelder that this was so that Mark would not receive any notification and wake up. We believe that Lori returned home at approximately 1:59 a.m., since that is when her phone reconnects to the resident's Wi-Fi. When Lori arrives back home, she takes the W driveway. She drives past where Mr. Phillips' body is located in the driveway and parks next to the house facing the M driveway. And you'll see a picture of how she's parked, where she's parked early on in this case. She will later tell investigator Leinfelder that she noticed the dining room lights were on and that the door was unlocked. Lori explained that at this time she wanted to go to bed. After attempting to sleep on the couch, which was not comfortable, she eventually went upstairs to sleep. At 4:55 a.m., Lori rearms the home's security camera system, meaning it's on again. The motion sensors are activated. Around 6 a.m., Lori stated that she went into Mark's room to demand an apology from him, at which point she realized he wasn't there. Lori stated she then went outside to see if the other car, the couple's other car, was still in the garage, which is when she discovered Mark's body laying in the driveway. At 6:29 a.m., Lori calls 911. The judge has already read the elements of what I am going to have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt throughout this trial. For cause, in terms of what had happened to Mr. Phillips, you're going to hear from Dr. Reichert, the forensic pathologist who investigated Mr. Phillips. You're going to hear from Dr. Reichert that Mr. Phillips had extensive blunt force trauma type injuries on his left side, that many of his left ribs were broken, and some of those were compound fractures, meaning that they damaged the surrounding tissue. He's going to tell you that a significant amount of blood existed in his chest cavity, that one of the lungs had been punctured by a compounded broken rib, that Mr. Phillips had a subdermal hematoma or brain bleeding due to a force-type injury to his head. The evidence from his testimony will show that the type and nature of Mr. Phillips' injuries were too severe for them to be caused by anything other than a significant amount of force. Dr. Riker will tell you that that force and the injuries that he observed in his autopsy and analysis are consistent with a crushing type injury as opposed to a mere slip and fall. Dr. Riker will testify that Mr. Phillips' injuries are consistent with being run over or crushed by a truck. Dr. Riker will also tell you that Mr. Phillips, due to the amount of blood found in his chest cavity and that his heart was still pumping blood, likely did not die immediately. The evidence as a whole will show that there was no other likely cause of Mr. Phillips' death other than the truck that Mr. Phillips left the driveway in that night. Some of the other pieces of evidence we're going to have is that the truck was taken into impound. The crime lab had a chance to take a look at it. They look at the undercarriage of the truck, and they notice some things. We'll talk more about that during the testimony that you'll hear, both from Trevor Nalid and eventually Ruth Hank from the Wisconsin Trace Division of the Crime Lab. They found multiple things, fibers, hairs, other debris. But they found one thing, a thread about 3 or 4 inches, and again, the exact amount I would testify, listen to their testimony, not my words, because it's not evidence. They find a cotton fiber thread that is consistent, can't say for certain, but is consistent with the same jeans that Mr. Phillips was wearing when they found his body the next morning. You'll hear how they got to that conclusion. You'll hear how they use class characteristics to rule out other fibers, how cotton is a natural fiber. It is a common one, but that of the things they had pieced together, that fiber was found in the truck, underneath the truck, in the weight of its rear drive shaft, was consistent with the jeans that Mr. Phillips had. One of the earlier pictures you'll see in this case is Mr. Phillips' jeans that are torn. The harder one, or the other element, is that it's going to be up to you to decide, based on the evidence you hear, what you believe Miss Phillips knew when they left the home that night. You will not hear her acknowledge that she knew or believed that she hit her husband with their truck. It will be up to you to decide, based on the evidence you hear and the inferences you can draw, to decide the answer to that question. Was Miss Phillips aware of what had happened? When did she become aware? And did her awareness of that risk, did she create that substantial risk by driving out that night? And was she aware of it? To that effect, you'll hear statements made from her to law enforcement, written, and you'll get to see the video, her interview, the testimony from witnesses that night, what we learned from the cell phone extraction of her phone, what was learned from the cell phone extraction of Mark's phone. You will not see the actual video of what happened in that driveway, but you will learn something about the cameras, their positioning, how they work, and see some of that. And then ultimately, we'll present in a similar fashion to the sum up I gave you here today, what we learned from her actions before and after the incident, based on the security camera footage that we received, what we found in her phones, the text messages she sent, her statements, and how she describes it to both Investigator Leinfelder, but her own friends. And ultimately, we'll be asking, when the whole picture comes together, I'll make my closing, and I will be able to argue, and I will argue to you that when you put the evidence together in the totality of the circumstances, that there will be no doubt that Ms. Phillips committed this crime. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Zacher?
I don't mean to extend it all, but
Three seconds, maybe 4. That's all the time that Lori Phillips had. Because that's all the time that Mark Phillips gave her. Because the man, Mr. Phillips, had been berating her, battering her, and strangling her throughout the night, was charging right where she was sitting. This is the story of an ordinary woman caught up in an impossible situation. Somebody who's in the middle of nowhere, nobody there to protect her, no conceivable way to fight back, forced into a decision that she never asked to make, and given just seconds to do it. When Mark reached within a fraction of a second getting to Lori at that driver's side door, her instincts took over. Her adrenaline kicked in, and she hit the gas, escaping the man who was attacking her in rural Holmen. Now she's on trial for his death. There are a lot of questions that you're going to have to answer in the course of this trial, ladies and gentlemen. But perhaps chief amongst them is why. Because there's a tremendous difference, as the judge read to you in the elements, between somebody who's acting under reasonable or unreasonable circumstances leading to that risk. And you're going to hear a lot about the why from Ms. Phillips and our side of the case in the course of this action. Because there's a huge difference between a tragic accident and criminally reckless homicide. And I don't mean to imply that it was always this way between Lori and Mark. She'll be the first to tell you that they had more good days than bad. That when he was sober, when he was with her on his good days, he was the man that she married. She loved him. Good provider, good husband, somebody that she was proud to call a member of her family. But when Mark was drunk, it was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Just totally flipping a switch. And you'll hear that when Mark got drunk enough, he would often turn into somebody who was insecure, jealous, and angry. Those insecurities revolved around Lori. It wouldn't take much. Something as simple as another man looking at her in a bar, another man talking to her, finding a text message or social media from some man that he didn't know, and Mark would turn on her. And Lori will tell you that she was always the one at fault. It was her fault that these men were paying attention to her. On the days when Mark was more in control of himself, the abuse was solely verbal. You'll hear that, whether in public or private, from Lori and other witnesses, Mark had no problem whatsoever screaming at his wife. She's a slut. She's a fucking whore. She's somebody who's paying attention to other men because she doesn't really love him. It happened time and time and time again. But on far too many circumstances, the abuse wasn't just verbal. It turned physical. You're going to hear about just a few of these incidents in the year or so leading up to Mr. Phillips' death. And we're going to start in January of 2018 for Lori's birthday celebration. You're going to hear that Lori and Mark had rented a party bus. They had a sober driver, and the plan was they were going to load up some of Lori's friends and family and go out bar hopping in Winona. Once they got to Winona, you're going to hear that Mark was drunk and eventually saw a bar owner that Lori had known for years wish her happy birthday and kind of give her a tap on the shoulder. Nothing sexual about it. Mark didn't think so. He exploded. Began screaming at her that she was a whore and a slut and a bitch. Following her into the next bar, where this was observed by a young man named Matt Juror. You're going to hear Mr. Juror testify that he's been a bartender for a while. He's used to dealing with boisterous behavior. And in what he observed between Lori and Mark, crossed the line in his words. That Mark was berating Lori in front of everyone in the bar. He was grabbing her physically by the arm. He was trying to drag her out of the bar, all while screaming at her that she was a slur commonly known as the N-word, loving whore. Mr. Gurek will tell you that he reached the point where he felt the need to intervene, told Mark this wasn't going to happen, and after Mark stopped berating Lori, he gathered up all of their friends and family and left Lori stranded in Winona. He apologized the next day. You'll hear that he always did. And a large number of the times, Lori wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he would change his behavior and become a different man the next time that they went out. But the apologies became far too frequent. On August 4th of 2018, you'll hear that Ms. Phillips made a 911 call from the home that she shared with Mr. Phillips. The Crosse County Sheriff's deputies, Joseph Pernine, Peter Sloan, and Patty Stoughton Juror responded to the call. Mr. Phillips had been drinking all day long, from Bloody Marys and beers at 7:30 a.m. to a golf tournament, all the way until about 11:30 a.m. or 11:30 p.m. When he came down home from the bar. Lori knew that he was upset, and she knew that he was drunk, and she made a decision before Mark stumbled home. She locked the door. She said, "I don't want to deal with this. You're not going to be pleasant when you come home and you're drunk and you're angry." And she hoped that he would sleep it off in the man cave, which is a separate structure immediately adjacent to the house. Pretty nice man cave, has couches and a wood pellet stove and some other amenities. But Mr. Phillips didn't want to listen to that. He called his parents over to the house, began slamming himself into the door, eventually kicking it down, shattering it inwards, and rushing into the bedroom where Lori had been sleeping. In that position, Mr. Phillips lunged towards an end table immediately to Lori's side of the bed. That concerned her, because there were only two things on that end table. Number one, which she eventually ended up grabbing in the dark, was a remote control that controlled the settings on an overhead ceiling fan. The other was a loaded handgun. Mark's physical and verbal abuse didn't stop, and Lori was able to call 911, prompting this response from the sheriff's department. You'll hear that when the officers arrived, Mark had already fled, but Sergeant Cernine concluded that was probable cause to arrest Mr. Phillips for disorderly conduct and criminal damage to property as domestic offenses. He was arrested the next day. You're going to hear that Lori did something that a lot of survivors of domestic abuse do. As the days and weeks went on, she started to roll her statement back. She started to recant. She said, "Maybe this was my fault after all. Maybe I should have just let him back in. Maybe Mark didn't really mean to go for the gun." It's not what she was telling people simultaneously. And you'll hear that Lori eventually reached out to a member of Mark's family, happens to be an attorney, and say, "I'm not scared of Mark. I want him home." Lori's going to tell you that that wasn't actually the case. She felt some pressure, but at the same time, she loved him. She wasn't aware of exactly how toxic that relationship was at the time. Nevertheless, after that incident, Lori had some recognition that the relationship wasn't healthy. She broke things off with Mark, or at least suggested taking a break, moved out of the house, and got her own apartment in the city of Onalaska. Mark wasn't ready to be done with her. Continued to monitor her, keep tabs on her, ask her who she's hanging around with, ask her what men are showing interest and showing up unannounced. That culminated in one terrifying evening for Ms. Phillips. You'll hear that once more she knew that Mark had been drinking most of the day. The two of them had been arguing across phone or social media or some other platform, and Lori had the sense that things just weren't going to go well. She had the sense that Mark was in a position where he could lose his control. So before she went to bed that evening, she closed her door, locked it, put the chain on, and then did something that she's never done before. Propped up a tall kitchen stool up against the door latch so that if Mark was tempted to come over and try to kick the door in, it would make that possible. After taking these steps, she went to bed, but didn't sleep through the night. She woke up to the sound of her door crashing open. The locking mechanism in the door jamb shattered. And next thing she knew, her ex-boyfriend was jumping on top of her in her bed in the middle of the night, pitch dark. He reeked of alcohol, but at the time she didn't know that because she couldn't breathe. He was strangling her. On top of her, both hands around her neck, and she couldn't breathe. And that's one of many times where Lori figured she wasn't going to see daylight again. Mark let up. He was screaming and yelling about some man that he believed was interested in Lori. And Lori did what she always did. She submitted. Told him what he wanted to hear. Told him that there would never be anyone else other than Mark Phillips. The domestic abuse didn't stop after that point. Lori and Mark did get back together. Lori did move back into the home in Holmen. And she'll tell you that during the course of their arguments, when Mark would get so out of control, she legitimately believed that any given argument could be the last thing that she heard. She'll tell you about going to sleep in a guest room and playing possum, freezing absolutely still, because when Mark appeared at the door jamb, she believed that he was holding the gun in his hand. And a lot of you might be asking the question, why would she keep coming back to him? What is she doing with this guy that's hurting her all the time? And you're going to hear the answer throughout the course of this trial. Lori was so caught up in the cycle of power and control that she had no idea exactly how toxic this relationship was. Lori was so caught up in the belief that this man loved her intensely because of the outbursts of being so protective of her that she couldn't see exactly how out of control he could become. And in December of 2018, the two of them tied the knot. Lori figured that that would be a fresh start. That if he loved her enough to marry her, he'd love her enough to stop hurting her. They figured that they would move to Bismarck, North Dakota, where Mark had recently been promoted at his work, and that with new people, they could have a fresh start. That didn't end up being the case. February 22nd started innocuously enough. Ms. Phillips had a couple of friends who wanted to have a goodbye dinner with her, Hannah Klinsky and Adam Stevens, and she and Mark went out to Sloopy's alma mater on the north side of La Crosse. By all accounts, that dinner was a good time. No drama, they had some food, had a couple drinks, and reminisced. And at one point, Ms. Klinsky mentioned that she and Adam were going to another bar on the south side of La Crosse. It's over by Carboni's now on Ward Avenue, then called the Dive Bar. And they were going there for a drawing of a large amount of cash, I think $1,500 or something like that. Lori and Mark figured it'd be fun, so they tagged along. And that's where things started to take a turn. Because once they reached the dive bar, Mark started drinking more heavily. He had beer after beer after beer, and Lori recognized a sign that she's seen all too many times before. Mark was getting drunk. We know for a fact that Mark was drunk that evening because the most conservative estimate of his alcohol toxicology at the point of autopsy was a .149. For those of you who don't know or aren't keeping track, that's almost 2 times the legal limit to drive a motor vehicle in the States. The highest value was a .204. And it was in this condition that Lori will tell you that she started to go on high alert. Because whenever Mark got drunk is when the drama happened. So Lori would do everything in her power to not attract the attention of men, not talk to other men that Mark didn't bring over to the table, and do nothing that could set him off. And that's where they came into contact with the gentleman that they both knew, a guy by the name of Scott Cundy. It's the type of encounter that all of us have had probably dozens of times in bars across the state. Came up and said, "Oh, hey, good to see you guys. You should stick around. Guess who's coming? Terry LaFleur." Now, at the time, that didn't even mean anything to her. You're going to hear that her only connection to Mr. LaFleur was that they both used to bartend part-time at another bar that doesn't exist anymore, Goes Chapter 2, 20 years in the past. But Mr. Cundy pressed and said, "Well, Lori, you know Terry, right?" Indicating that the two of them had worked together before. And Lori's response was somewhat atypical, saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, what does that mean? I've never slept with Terry." Trying to cut Mark off on the impression that Mr. LaFleur was coming there for some romantic purpose. Didn't work. Mr. Phillips immediately exploded, calling her a whore, blaming her for Mr. LaFleur coming out there, and repeatedly insisting that Lori just wanted to have sex with Mr. LaFleur. You're going to hear from others that were at that table at the dive bar that evening and talk about how Mr. Phillips was visibly creating a scene. It's not particularly high quality footage. I would say it's kind of akin to a VHS style security surveillance system, but you're going to see footage of Mr. Phillips at the dive bar table, flailing his arms, pounding his hands, hovering over Lori, and visibly screaming at her during that time frame. And you're going to see at one point, it got severe enough where Hannah's father, Bob Klinsky, got up and tried to kind of half-heartedly break things up and give Lori a hug and say, "We're sure going to miss you," hoping that it would dissolve the dispute, but it never happened. Lori knew that the night was unraveling, and she and Mark decided that they would go to another bar in Holmen for another draw. Lori figured that if they got away from that bar and where Mr. LaFleur was going to show up, that would be the end of the drama, but it wasn't. When they got into the parking lot, what did they run into? Scott Cundy. Mr. Cundy had something to show them. Terry LaFleur had arrived. Lori's going to tell you that she had, kind of an awkward hello. 30 seconds, a minute. They reminisced about the old days when they really weren't that close to begin with. got into the truck, and left. She figured that was the end of it. It wasn't. Mark was white hot inside of that truck. He was furious. He was screaming that this was all his fault, or all her fault, that she really wanted to stay there and have sex with Mr. LaFleur. And his anger reached the point that Lori became scared of him and said, please, please just take me back to my friends with Adam and Hannah, and we can figure things out later. You'll hear Mark that obliged that request. He turned around, parked in front of the dive bar, and that's where the first physical attack of the evening happened. After he parked the truck, Mark lunged over towards Lori, grabbed her head with enough force that he could force it down to the seats. You'll hear that in the course of this attack, his arm manipulated her earlobe to the point that her earring came ripping out, showing that she had visible blood after she walked back into the bar. Mark climbed on top of Lori, put his elbow on top of her chest, all of his 220 pounds on top of her, and then protruded his forearm in a familiar move to her, choking her across her windbag. Couldn't breathe. She had no idea what was happening. All the while, Mark was screaming that she just wanted to fuck Terry LaFleur. Mark eventually let her up. But before he let her go, he did something else that Lori was familiar with. He demanded her cell phone. You're going to hear that Mark didn't like Lori having access to others when they were having those types of disputes. And he took that phone from her regularly, but in this case, Lori certainly submitted to that request as well. She went back into the bar and eventually had a discussion with Hannah, who, at one point or another, was shocked enough that she said, I don't think you should move to North Dakota. I don't think you're safe, Lori. Now, Mr. Phillips comes back into the bar, and we know what he does because we're going to hear from the witnesses to this. Comes back in, he's creating a scene, and he angrily points at Lori and he says, get your fucking ass back in the truck. Screaming at her in front of everyone else. Lori wasn't in the mood to get back in that truck. She didn't feel safe. Mr. Phillips began call bombing Adam Stevens' cell phone from Lori's. 2, 3, 4 times, each time trying to convince Mr. Stevens to get Lori to get back into the truck. When he called again, an exasperated Mr. Stevens took the cell phone, handed it to Lori and said, can you just talk to him? And Mr. Phillips had a request. He asked Lori if Terry LaFleur was still in the bar. And she said, yeah, I see him over there. He told her to go over to Terry LaFleur. At which point he said, tell Terry that I'm going to come in here and kick his ass. Lori will tell you that she did that, but did it in a way where she was moving her finger around her temple, kind of like, he's crazy, don't worry about this. Now, Mr. LaFleur was kind of a low-drama guy. He didn't know what was going on, but he knew that he didn't want a part of it, and he and his buddies left. At some point after Mr. LaFleur left, Mark starts to settle down a little bit, gives Lori back her cell phone, and texts her this message, I'm so sorry, I love you. And Lori will tell you that she believed that this was a sign that Mark was starting to settle down and realized that he had been out of control earlier. So eventually, as the night reached a second conclusion, she decided, all right, I'll go home with Mark tonight. She said goodbye to Hannah and Adam. She ducked into the bathroom, but before she did, there was another incident with Mark where he exploded again. When Lori ducked into the bathroom, she texted Hannah Klinsky. She said, shit's just getting real. Don't respond to this. I'm deleting this text message. Just letting somebody know what was happening, just in case things escalated later that night. And when Lori got out of the bathroom, she saw that Mark must have gone to the restroom herself and had an idea. She figured she'd get into the truck, she'd drive home, she'd let Mark find a friend or sleep it off someplace else and they could deal with it. She didn't even get backed out of the parking spot before Mark reappeared. Pulled her out of the car, took her by her arms. He slammed her up against the side of the truck and he was screaming at her about Terry LaFleur, about leaving. And at that point, Lori raised her voice and screamed, stop, stop, Mark, you've done enough. Hoping that somebody in the parking lot would intervene. Hoping that she'd have another Mr. Juror who could come up and say, this isn't going to happen in the parking lot between you two. Nobody did. And nobody did as Mark grabbed Lori with enough force to leave visible bruises on her bicep days after the fact, yanked her all the way around the truck, threw her to the passenger side door, slammed the door, and then punched the window right where her head was. She'd never seen her husband that angry before, and he was taking her home alone to rural Holmen. The ride home wasn't any better. Mark was red hot. She was as angry as he was as angry as she'd ever seen. And she described him as like somebody that she didn't even recognize. Not the man that she married. And during that ride, Lori made a couple decisions. Number one, she decided that she didn't feel safe staying with Mark that night. And as soon as they got home, she was going to get her contact lens case, her eyeglasses, and go find someplace else to stay. Decision number two was a little bit more permanent. Took off her wedding ring, put it in Mark's hand, and said, "Take this. I don't want it anymore." Thinking that that might calm him down, thinking that he could lose her. You'll hear that it worked for a little bit. And Mark said, "Please, please, please, don't do that. Don't take that back. I love you. You're my wife." But Lori left it in his hands. When she got back home, you're going to hear that Lori followed through on her plan. She put a couple of undrink cans of seltzer that Mark had in the car in the kitchen, got her contact lens case and her eyeglasses, and got back into the truck. And the next she saw Mark, he was charging out the back door of the home with his fist out, hitting right into her face at the open door. Lori reacted reflexively, going, "No, no, 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 no," thinking that she was about to get punched in the face, but he didn't. When it became apparent that she was actually leaving, Mark said, "Well, you can't leave until I get all of my belongings out of this truck." Walking around to the passenger side of the truck, flinging open the door, and beginning to pile up a pile of property from the center console of the glove compartment onto the passenger side seat. You'll see a photo of this at some point during the trial. The usual junk that most of us accumulate in our cars in the process of owning them. Receipts, bills, chewing gum, sunglasses, some can koozies. And in the process of doing this, he's still yelling and screaming at Lori. And he takes that can koozie that Mr. Burdick told you about, something that he gave Lori on her birthday. It has a pair of cartoon breasts on it, and it says "Tits my birthday." He threw it at her and said, "That's all you're good for anyways." Lori will tell you that she kind of flicked it back over, marking approximately the spot where the front passenger door was at the time that the truck was parked there. There's another piece of evidence that Mark was going through in reference that will become important later. He said that he found a couple of tokens for free drinks at a local tavern. He said, "I'm going to take these tokens and go find some women and bring them back to the house." During this process, Lori figured, if I can get my cell phone out and turn on the video, I might be able to capture some of this so they can see what he's like when he gets in this state. She got her phone out, got it up, didn't quite get the record function set, then Mark saw the phone and lunged for it, knocking it down to the driver's side floor. She looked at Mark, and she saw a face that was filled with sheer rage. She'd never seen him that angry. And as soon as they locked eyes, Mark began tearing around the front of the truck to the driver's side. Lori had every reason to believe that what happened when Mark got to that driver's side was going to include, at the very least, more physical abuse, if not her worst fears. You'll hear that she was in a moment of panic, that she's put into this situation where she has no idea how to react. That when Mark clears the front of the truck, Miss Phillips' instincts are taking over. That urge to fight or flight takes over, and as he reaches the side of the truck within an instant of being able to wrench that door open and pull Miss Phillips out, her instincts took over and she hit the gas. She didn't look back. Miss Phillips will tell you that there's only one reason that she fled. Because she was scared. Because she was reacting to the situation that was presented to her. And you're going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, that nobody's quite sure exactly how Mr. Phillips was injured. I expect the state's investigators and Dr. Reichert even to acknowledge as much. But if there's one thing I expect the evidence to establish, it's that this was not a head-on collision. Ms. Phillips did not run Mark Phillips down in front of the truck. You're going to see photos of the truck, and you're going to hear from the investigators in this case who will tell you that the truck was spotless. In fact, I expect them to testify that the truck showed absolutely no sign that it had been involved in a collision. Dr. Reichert will testify that Mark's injuries were not consistent with what he would typically see with an upright pedestrian. And I expect Dr. Reichert and others to acknowledge that there are any number of circumstances that could have caused Mark to slip, fall, and become caught towards the back end of the truck. You're going to see photographs of an aftermarket rail or a step that Mark had installed. Obvious tripping hazard had he reached the area where Ms. Phillips said that he reached when she hit the gas. You're going to see that there's plenty of room where Mr. Phillips could have fallen and been dragged for a short period of time. But what we know for a fact is that this accident, this collision, assuming it was Ms. Phillips, didn't occur within her field of vision. It occurred when she was fleeing. And you're going to have a bunch of facts thrown at you throughout this trial, ladies and gentlemen. And at the end of the day, it's going to amount to a jigsaw puzzle with about half the pieces gone. Nevertheless, it's still important to try to figure out what happened, because that'll help you answer those three major questions. Number one, who caused a substantial risk of death or great bodily harm? One of them is consistent with what the state's asking for. The other is consistent with Ms. Phillips not being prepared. Number two, was Lori personally aware of a substantial and unreasonable risk caused by her behavior, not Mark's, at the time that she fled? Which leads us to the why. Was this so objectively unreasonable that it constitutes criminal recklessness under the circumstances rather than a tragic accident that Ms. Phillips was forced into? And as you're going to hear, there's a tremendous difference in the legal sphere between risking somebody's life for no good reason and reacting, relying on your human instincts because you believe you need to get to safety. One of those is consistent with a guilty verdict, the other is not. And one of the issues that I expect to come up repeatedly is this issue of whether or not Lori knew that Mark had been injured. And I expect that after you hear all this evidence, your answer will be unequivocally no. Everything happened incredibly fast. You're going to hear about Lori describing how her heart was beating out of her chest, just trying to escape this man in a sense. And we know what Lori was thinking in the moments immediately thereafter, because she began using her cell phone. Amazing contraptions. We're walking around with thousands of times of computing power in our pockets than the Apollo astronauts had when they landed on the moon. And our phones are almost an extension of our very thoughts these days. And in Lori's case, they were an extension of hers. But what does she text Hannah Klinsky just moments after leaving Mark and going to the subdivision to hide? He just freaked again. He was at the passenger side of the truck and tried to come at me around the truck, but I took off. I don't even know what to do. He's lost it tonight. He promised he would never touch me. He lied. At 10:57 p.m., again just minutes after fleeing her husband, Lori sent the following text to Mark. I wish you the best, but the best will never be with me. You lost everything tonight because you let your mind get the best of you. I cannot even believe you put your hands on me. Good luck in Bismarck. Lori will tell you that there's a simple reason why she sent him that text. She had no reason to believe that he had been injured. She had no reason to believe that he had died. She wanted him to know that this very likely cost him his marriage. And she wanted him to know right after she fled from him. After hiding in the subdivision for a few minutes, Lori waited for Mark to come racing by in the Subaru, the other vehicle that Lori typically drove. And not seeing him there, she began looking for a hotel. She went to the Comfort Inn and there was no room available. She began searching for hotels near her once more, ladies and gentlemen, because she believed that Mark was alive, well, and furious, and she didn't feel safe going back home. Eventually, she made a reservation at the Baymont Inn, and you'll see the footage of Lori driving over to the Baymont and the reception desk. She hands over her driver's license and credit card, and is only told that, well, because you made the reservation so close to midnight, it automatically booked for the following evening. And by the way, the Baymont's also full. Lori didn't know quite what to do at that point, so she went to Woodman's, used the restroom, and sat in the parking lot, thinking that she could just spend a few hours in the truck until Mark sobered up. And during that time frame, she began using her cell phone again. Mr. Burdick told you, she, aside from looking for a hotel, she had a couple of specific searches on her Google. She searched for physical abuse, and physical abuse quit. Both were misspelled, and both we attribute to fat finger, so to speak. The characters are right next to one another, but that's what Lori was searching for. She wanted to put some context into what had just happened, what was happening in a relationship, how she should feel about this, how Mark should feel about this. And when she found a quote that somewhat encapsulated her feelings on that evening, she copied, pasted, and sent it to her husband. An abuser can seem emotionally needy. You can get caught in the trap of catering to him, trying to fill a bottomless pit. But he's not so much needy as entitled, so no matter how much you give him, it will never be enough. He'll just keep coming up with more demands because he believes his needs are your responsibility until you feel drained down to nothing. Lori will tell you once more that when she sent this text, she wanted Mark to read it. She wanted him to reflect on his behavior and how he hurt her. She had no idea whatsoever that he had been injured. Now, there's no dispute that in this time frame, Lori checked the camera system repeatedly. So here's what you're going to hear about that. The camera system had been disarmed by Mark's phone on February 21st. They had been selling a bunch of items on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, I believe, and the motion detectors kept going off and alerting their phones to the point that Mark shut them down. They weren't rearmed until Lori started looking at some point after she fled Mr. Phillips. And she's going to tell you that the reason that she looked on the cameras is pretty simple. One, she wanted to see if there was any evidence of Mark coming after her in the Subaru. See if Mark had taken the Subaru out to go to a different bar, go hang out with a buddy, or maybe leave the home for the night. And number two, in the back of her mind, she had that comment about Mark saying that he's going to bring some women back to the house. So she started checking the cameras to see if that happened, particularly above the hot tub that they had out by the man cave. It's undisputed that Lori Phillips did not delete any video footage from that camera system, and it's undisputed that Mark Phillips would not have been visible from that camera system based on where it was positioned. We're going to show you a video of that, ladies and gentlemen, to show you that Mark's body came to rest in a large snowbank that would have been completely invisible from the camera system that evening. Ultimately, though, it's the camera system that captures the moment in which Lori discovers Mark had been outside and was ultimately dead. Lori at some point decided that she was going to go home. Got cold, she couldn't find a hotel room, and she figured that if she disarmed the cameras, it wouldn't alert Mark when she got back in. When Lori got back in, she went to the restroom and eventually went upstairs to sleep in a bedroom so that Mark didn't look in the main guest room looking for her. At some point before she got up, she rearmed the cameras because that's something that she's gotten in trouble with Mark in the past too. He wanted those cameras operational. So she turned them back in. And ultimately those cameras captured the moment that Ms. Phillips found her husband dead. Now, about 6:30 a.m., Lori gets up. She uses the restroom. She goes downstairs, in her words, to demand an apology from Mark. She flung open the door, figuring that he'd be hung over and sobered up, and all that was there was an unmade bed and a bunch of pillows. This didn't concern her, because she figured that Mark had likely taken the other car out and ended up at a bar or a friend's house or someplace else. Maybe he was out looking for her. So she put on her boots and decided to go out to the exterior garage, look through the side door to see if the Subaru was there. This captures the moment that Lori exits the house. You can see, ladies and gentlemen, that Lori is walking towards the direction of the exterior garage, and you can see the exterior garage door, that, I guess, almond shaded door on the red garage over there. Doesn't appear to be in distress. Appears almost to be annoyed at that point. Step number 2 depicts her discovery. And this one's much less about what you observe and much more about what you hear. You can hear Ms. Phillips off camera screaming, "Oh my God," as she turned and saw her husband dead inside of the snowbank at the side of the driveway. Step number 3 is Ms. Phillips' reaction as she runs back to the house to get her phone and call 911. extremely distraught, screaming, yelling, and crying, even well outside of the range where she would have been on camera. The 911 call that follows is difficult to listen to. It depicts somebody who's in the most panicked and worst moments of her life, trying to relate to this 911 dispatcher that her husband was dead. You're going to hear that help arrived approximately 10 minutes after the fact in the form of the Crosse County Sheriff's Deputy, Michael Valencia. And Officer Valencia took some initial observations, but among those, he and others described Ms. Phillips as essentially hysterical, distraught, totally beside herself, shaking so hard that she couldn't calm down. And the one question that ultimately came up in the course of investigating whether this was a crime or not was, how could Ms. Phillips drive by and not know that Mr. Phillips was there? And we're going to talk about that at length, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to hear from Sergeant Valencia himself, first officer on scene, describing snowbanks that were plowed up approximately 3+ feet high on either side of this long driveway. And he's going to tell you that when he turned into that driveway, he couldn't see Mr. Phillips' body positioned inside of that snowbank until he was literally right on top of it. Sergeant Valencia had a squad car video operating that day. We're going to show that to you frame by frame from the center of his vehicle. You're not going to be able to see Mr. Phillips inside of that snowbank the same route that Ms. Phillips drove off. You won't be able to see him anywhere in that squad car video, as a matter of fact. But aside from the testimony, we're also going to show you some photographs. Believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Phillips is present in this photograph. This is a view up the, westbound side of the driveway of this horseshoe. And it's viewing directly the direction that Ms. Phillips would have traveled by at 2:30 a.m. in the morning, no natural lighting. At the very edge of the driveway, near that large berm of snow, you can see a tiny section of black peeking out. That's the very edge of Mr. Phillips's, concluded that Lori wasn't at fault. You're going to hear Sergeant Valencia say out loud on the squad car audio that the footprints that he observed in the snow were consistent with what Lori said. She went out looking for him in the garage, went down, saw him laying down, ran back to the house and ran back to Mark after getting her phone to call 911. But as more investigators got involved in this and more people arrived at the scene, they began exploring, well, what if something did go wrong? And that's where we started to get a narrow focus on the evidence. Now, I don't fault the investigators in this case. They're human. But like all humans, they tend to make assumptions. And when you make assumptions, ladies and gentlemen, you tend to miss the evidence that's right in front of you, suggesting that you might be incorrect. And you're going to hear about several items of evidence in this case that weren't collected, that weren't examined, that had every ability to exonerate Ms. Phillips outright. It wasn't collected. And if there's one question I want you to ask yourselves as you're listening to this evidence, it's, does this theory make sense in light of every bit of evidence? Not just the evidence that suggested that something wrong had happened, but the evidence that suggested that nothing wrong had happened in that instant. These are emotional cases. I recognize that there are members of Mark's family who loved him in life that are here today because they love him in death. I'm not asking any of you to turn off your humanity in that process. It's okay to feel empathy for them. They've lost somebody too. But if there's any other request that I make of you as you hear this evidence, it's this. Turn on the logical sides of your brain and keep them turned on. Because ultimately, it's the facts and not the feelings that'll adjudicate those important questions at the close of this case. What happened to Mark Phillips was tragic, but it wasn't a homicide. This was an ordinary woman in impossible circumstances, a domestic violence victim doing the best that she could in the seconds that she had. At the close of this case, I'm going to ask you to return the only proper verdict, not guilty.
Thank you, Mr. Zacher. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take an afternoon break. Obviously, we've been going a long time here. What I'd ask you, please don't talk about the case with each other during these breaks. We'll take about 10 to, I always say 10 minutes, but it's really going to be 15. But about 10 minutes if we can. If you have questions, ask Keith or Terry. They can help you out. Remember, it's only more about where we're at. I'll just give you a heads up. My plan is for everybody is to be done at 4 today. So 4:15 at the latest, but really 4. So you can be out of here. And usually when we start up the next day, I have you come at 8:30 and we start up at 8:45. Unless there's something that comes up, but otherwise, that's what the intention is. And we'll take breaks halfway through the morning.